Hello, welcome back to the channel. Thank you as always for tuning in. Hope everyone's doing okay. So, musical topic that I wanted to discuss today. It's one that I've been video that I've been meaning to make for quite some time, but just never got. I haven't got around to it. But now is as good a time as any. It's about whether punk really existed in the UK before the proper explosion of punk in the late 70s. Now, if you're watching this video, I'm sure you kind of know the rough history of how punk came about and the timeline of it. So, it really kind of exploded in the UK. I suppose we are going sort of late 76. And of course, in 77, it was just, it was everywhere. It completely changed music and is a really important part of musical history. The influences of this have been, it's discussed so many times on documentaries. You could argue that pub rock in the mid 70s, bands like Dr. Feelgood, really had an influence on it. And that's, very, very true. And certainly, there are certain bands from the USA, which, many would argue did have an influence. You've got the Stooges, which I think many bands of that genre have name checked. I've got MC5. And as well, of course, from the US, you could certainly argue that the New York Dolls, and then later on, just before the real advent of UK punk, the Ramones definitely had a profound influence as well, without a doubt. It's been very much talked about. However, there are just certain bands out there, I think, from the late 60s and through the early 70s that really kind of had that punk attitude. Now, whether they were influences or subconscious influences, I don't know. But I just wanted to show them here, get some thoughts. This is just what I think, so this is what I do. So, right, let's get some examples. So, first example would be this band. Let's take the plastic off because we're getting a bit of glare on that. So this album's from 1969. It's Edgar Broughton Band. It's their debut called Wazza Wazza. And they released several albums after this through the mid-70s, and then they kind of sporadically released albums kind of here and there. But their heyday was 1969 through to about 75. Now, this record here is just, it's just kind of heavy riffing, but not in a kind of virtuoso way. It's done in a way that's kind of sticks to sort of basic rock and roll sensibilities, and it just has that attitude. They were quite anarchic, as were, I guess you could argue, all the punk bands are. The things they were singing about, the American war. Now, I know psychedelic bands in the US were kind of singing about sort of war in Vietnam, but it was unusual for a UK band to be doing it. But to do it with such sort of real attitude and kind of venom. And the way they riff, the way they do things, it's just got a real sort of punky attitude to it. It really does. And yes, they're not a punk band. Look at them. They're long-haired hippies. But this is not prog rock. This is not blues rock, and I wouldn't call it psychedelia. But anyone who enjoys punk could well enjoy this album, and certainly everything that followed. This is about as raw as they got. They got a little bit more polished as they went along, but it's kind of dirty, gritty, and it just has that attitude of punk. It's just not played at breakneck speed. Another one. You might kind of think, oh, what is he talking about? Hawkwind. We've got the album Do Re Mi Fa Sol La Ti Do. I played this recently, and the opening track, Brainstorm, has a riff that just bursts in, and I was listening to it. I hadn't played this for quite some time before I played it again, and it just sounds like a punk riff. It honestly just sounds like a riff that is just going to burst into a sort of 2.5 minute power pop sort of, heavy single. Of course, it doesn't. It goes on for about 12 minutes, and it's more of a sort of psychedelic jam. But it's still just got this real kind of dirty, riffy sound that you might associate with punk. Again, I mean, Hawkwind were not, they were not sort of short-haired, leather jacket wearing, what you would associate with punk in the late 70s. Again, they had hippie ideals. But at the same time, they had a bit of anarchy about them. They liked to play free festivals. At the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970, they believed it should have been free, as many of the audience did, so I hear. And they played a free concert outside, and they used to do this. It was that real attitude of kind of, going against the system, going against the establishment. So yeah, marginal inclusion again, but yeah, I just think the seeds of punk are definitely there in this band in places. Of course, they had Lemmy in, of course, and he was never a punk. Of course he wasn't. But Motorhead, who he formed, they were almost like a cross between sort of heavy metal and punk in a way, weren't they? And he did sort of hang around with the punks back in the late 70s. All these things to consider. Here we've got the Groundhogs. Now I'm only going to include this album in kind of like a pre-punk attitude. They were actually originally a blues band. They were derived from the blues in the late 60s, and like so many blues bands in the late 60s, they either went progressive, heavy, or just more experimental. They all did it. By about 1970, 71, they were all experimenting more than just 12 bar. With this album, they went completely political, and just an awful lot of social commentary in their lyrics. And again, it is simple, heavy riffing. The only thing that really sort of differentiates it from punk is the fact that it's not played at a sort of breakneck speed. There's no sort of 2.5 minute songs on here. They sound like slightly slowed down punk tunes that go on for 3 or 4 minutes. But yeah, the things that they're singing about, sort of, anti-war, things that are going, problems in society. It's just got that punk attitude. Before this was going on 7 years later, and I mean, they never really repeated this. As far as I'm concerned, this is their greatest album. They've done some really good albums, but this is their absolute greatest one, and it's just like a long lost punk classic. Everything else they did before they did this, it was blues. After this, they went a bit more experimental. They almost went into a little bit sort of a prog rock kind of area. But this is almost pure punk, and it is fantastic. Thank Christ for the Bomb by the Groundhogs. Another one is Pink Fairies, Kings of Oblivion. This is their third record. Again, there's no punks in this band, not with that long hair. But despite being quite psychedelic in the beginning, they were a heavy, riffy band, and again, anti-establishment, like Hawkwind, free festivals, and they just had this kind of rock and roll kind of sound that was more back to the roots than what was going on elsewhere in the late 70s. Marginal inclusion, but yeah, it's just got that kind of punky, dirty sound to it. It's great. This is a great record. Absolutely brilliant. I once spoke to a chap who, he's older than me, obviously, who went to see the Pink Fairies in the 70s, and he said they were so loud that half the audience kind of decanted into the bar area because they were actually unbearable to listen to. He said that they played at such volume that it was virtually unlistenable. I think he said he enjoyed it, but yeah, that's another thing. But yeah, it just sort of makes you think, doesn't it? Were the seeds of punk being formed here? Quite possibly. So this next one is probably the most obscure one. I don't think I've ever seen anyone on YouTube show this one. This is self-titled debut by Third World War. They did a second one, second album, aptly titled Third World War 2. This This can only be described as a punk album, and it came out in 1971, I believe. It might be 1970. 1970. This is pure punk. I mean, the musicianship on it, whilst I wouldn't say it's sloppy, it's not of the kind of calibre that you'd expect from an early 70s band where they were really trying to, be as good as possible. This and the things they are singing about all the way through from start to finish is pure punk. It is anti-monarchy, anti-establishment, anti-politics, social problems. Every single track, and it is a real dirty sound. That it's a gruff vocalist, shouty vocals, kind of dirty guitars. Again, unlike proper punk, kind of 1977 onwards, it's everything's slowed down. It's nothing's played at sort of fast speed. All the tracks, they're at least 3 minutes long. If you sped them up double, you would have a pure punk album on your hands here. And yeah, the attitude was there. The attitude very much was there. It wasn't all about sort of psychedelia and, tales from topographic oceans. Certain bands were singing about the things that punks were singing about in 1977. And this is a really good album. I haven't actually spun this for a while. I'm going to have to spin this again soon, as is their second one. Although that one, I think, is a little bit more... It's still got the attitude, but it's just a little bit more produced. They've got a few session musicians on board. But this one is so raw, so dirty. Definitely a punk album from the early 70s. Really is. And finally, I did talk about this record quite recently because I played it, and I think I showed it on one of my weekend spins. This one, I know I've read somewhere that this is considered to be the accidental first punk album of the 70s. This came out in 75. It's by Peter Hammill. It's called Nadir's Big Chance. Now, on this one, as I understand, he kind of goes into a bit of a character called Ricky Nadir. And he just wants to play rock and roll, kind of play his guitar. That's what the lyrics of the opening track suggest. What he's done, Peter Hamill's got his former backing band, or his kind of backing band, Van de Graaff Generator, on like a hiatus to just play dirty. They're just playing, they're just playing rock and roll. He screams the vocals out. And what you've got is something that predates Anarchy in the UK by about 2 years. And it's whether he saw the change on the horizon happening, or this was just an accident, is debatable. You'd probably have to ask Peter Hammill himself. But the results are really interesting. The whole album is not kind of punk. There are some kind of ballads and quirky songs on here, but certainly the opening track, and there's one called Birthday Goal, which it just sounds like a precursor to the Sex Pistols. And the fact is that John Lydon loves Peter Hammill, or loved him. I think he probably still does. And he even went on, at the height of his fame during the Sex Pistols, it may have been when he sort of formed Pill, he went on to a radio show and played some of his influences and played tracks from this album. So I would say this is, the Sex Pistols might not have sounded the way they were if it wasn't for this album. It's debatable. This is what I'm not preaching that this is the facts. I'm just saying it's subject to debate. It's just something to think about. And like everything by Peter Hammill, this is a great record. Definitely one to pick up. It is interesting because there's so much history out there about punk when it happened. I mean, there's books written about it, TV documentaries. Obviously, people talk about it on YouTube. It was such it. I think as a musical genre, it's kind of talked about more than any other genre in popular music, maybe with the exception of sort of Beatlemania. So, you know, we're all very aware of the influences and what happened and what, you know, where it came from and what people, you know, what people thought. There are just so many conflicts in there. I mean, there are many sort of punk musicians at the time who were saying, you know, it was year zero, that everything before the punk in 1977 was irrelevant, which, you know, is rubbish, absolute rubbish. And it's pretentious, absolutely pretentious to say something like that. It really is. But I mean, going back to John Lydon, I think he actually proved that that was actually not the case. I mean, he didn't really take any note. You know, he was like a punk, and he was surly and arrogant. Still is, isn't he? Really, in some ways. But um, I think he proved that, you know, no, it wasn't year zero. Particularly by doing that radio show where he was, you know, I've seen the listing. He's playing Peter Hammill, all sorts of earlier things. And when you sort of watch any podcasts or interviews with him now, which he does quite frequently, he talks about what he used to listen to, and it isn't what you would think. It really isn't. So all these bands saying about year zero, it's kind of, I think it's a load of marketing. I have to admit, I really blow hot and cold with John Lydon. If I watch podcasts, I find him very interesting, intelligent, entertaining. He is quite an eccentric, but then a lot of the time he ruins himself by sort of, you know, going on talk shows with Piers Morgan and doing adverts for butter. You know, it's one minute I think, yeah, he's all right. The next I'm like, oh God, no. But that's just the way it is. I'm digressing a bit here. So anyway, that's all I've really got to say here. It was just an idea for a video that I've had buzzing around, so I've finally done it. But I would be, and again, as always, I'm not spouting facts here. This is my opinion. This is just subject to debate. This is just what I think. I'm not proclaiming to be right and be sort of, you know, forcing the history of music down your throats. That's not what I'm doing here. However, I would, as always, love to hear your opinions. Do you think I'm completely barking up the wrong tree? Do you think I've got a point? Are there any other examples you can think of UK bands that were kind of pre-punk? Does pre-punk actually exist? My answer is yes, I think it does. But what do you think? Anyway, that's all for now. So until the next video, take care as always, and thank you very much for watching.